Rodney Perrone had installed cameras in every corner of his mansion, convinced that surveillance was the only way to protect his 3 daughters from a world that had already stolen their voices. But when he caught his new maid doing something impossible on the hidden feds, something no therapist, specialist, or doctor had achieved in 3 years, he realized the greatest threat to his children might have been his own fear all along. Rodney Perrone had built his empire on data, precision, and absolute control. Those same instincts had driven him to transform his sprawling estate into a web of hidden surveillance, not to guard his wealth, but to shield his daughters. 3 identical girls, always dressed in matching pink, who hadn't spoken a single word since the accident that took their mother 3 years ago. The tragedy hadn't just silenced them, it had shattered Rodney's belief that money could protect the people he loved. Since that day, the mansion had become a revolving door of specialists, speech therapists, child psychologists, and nannies who arrived with credentials and left with excuses. Some were competent but cold, others warm but ineffective. Most seemed more interested in the marble columns and designer furniture than in the 3 small girls who drifted through the halls like pink shadows. Rodney had caught things on camera that made his blood boil: a therapist checking her phone during sessions, a nanny yanking a child's arm in frustration, staff members gossiping about his broken daughters when they thought no one was listening. Each incident reinforced his conviction that the cameras weren't paranoia, they were necessity. So he installed more. Tiny lenses embedded in crown molding, hidden in picture frames, tucked into the spines of books. He told himself it was only to keep them safe. Yet even as the feeds streamed silently to his private office, Rodney found himself watching less and less. Seeing his daughter's mute existence playing out on a screen felt like reliving the funeral on an endless loop. When the latest nanny quit, citing the oppressive atmosphere and the children's unsettling silence, Rodney barely had the energy to care. He hired a replacement through his assistant, skimming a resume that was remarkably unremarkable. Linda Jenkins. No prestigious credentials, no experience with trauma cases, no glowing recommendations from wealthy families. Just a simple cover letter and references from ordinary people who described her as patient and intuitive. During the brief interview, Linda didn't gawk at the chandeliers or compliment his art collection. She didn't offer practiced sympathy about his daughters or promise miraculous breakthroughs. She asked only one question, her dark eyes steady and unimpressed by his billionaire status. "Do your daughters like to dance?" Rodney barely remembered answering. The first week passed in a blur of normalcy. Linda kept the house pristine, followed the girls' rigid schedule with precision, and maintained a professional distance that Rodney found almost refreshing. He remained buried in acquisitions and conference calls, barely seeing her except in passing. The triplets, however, seemed to notice her in ways they hadn't noticed anyone in years. They stopped hiding in their playroom when Linda entered. They lingered near the kitchen when she hummed quietly while preparing their meals. Their eyes, identical shades of blue, followed her movements with something Rodney couldn't quite name. One evening, Rodney returned home earlier than usual, his mind too restless for another late night at the office. He found himself standing in his study, staring at the wall of dormant monitors. For reasons he couldn't articulate, he reached forward and powered them on. He expected nothing. Perhaps that was why what he saw made him freeze, his hand suspended over the keyboard. On the center screen, Linda sat cross-legged on the floor of the vast living room, positioned in a triangle with his 3 daughters. She wasn't teaching them flashcards or running speech drills. She wasn't even speaking. She had removed her shoes and placed her palms flat against the hardwood floor, and the girls, his silent, unreachable daughters, had done the same, their small hands pressed to the wood, their pink dresses pooled around them. Linda's lips moved, but the camera's audio was too distant to catch the words. Then she did something that made Rodney lean closer to the screen. She began tapping the floor with her fingertips in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The triplets watched, transfixed. Then, one by one, they began tapping back, their small fingers creating answering patterns on the polished wood. And then Rodney heard it, a sound so unexpected that he checked the audio levels to make sure the system wasn't malfunctioning. Laughter. Soft, hesitant but unmistakable, coming from the mouths of his daughters who hadn't made a voluntary sound in 3 years. Rodney's hand trembled as he turned up the volume, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. On the screen, Linda smiled and tapped a new pattern. The girls responded, their fingers moving faster now, and another sound emerged. This one from the middle triplet, a small giggle that broke into something that almost resembled a word. Rodney sank into his chair, unable to look away from the feed, watching his daughters come alive in ways he'd thought were lost forever. And in that moment, staring at the hidden camera footage in his darkened office, he realized he'd been watching his children for 3 years without ever truly seeing them at all. The girls had stopped speaking on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, exactly 3 years and 4 months ago. Rodney remembered it with the precision of a man who had replayed the moment 1,000 times on feeds that no longer existed. His wife, Catherine, had been driving them home from a ballet recital when a delivery truck ran the intersection. The impact was brutal but not fatal. Catherine died 2 days later in the ICU. The triplets, Lily, Rose, and Violet, walked away with minor bruises and a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the air around them. The doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological response to trauma. They prescribed therapy, medications, breathing exercises, play therapy with puppets and dolls. Nothing worked. The girls moved through the mansion like 3 pink shadows, identical in their frilly dresses and white tights, their eyes wide and watchful, their mouths sealed shut. They communicated only in glances and gentle touches, a private language Rodney couldn't decode no matter how many specialists he hired. And he hired many. The first nanny lasted 6 weeks before she quit, claiming the silence made her skin crawl. The second was caught on camera scrolling through her phone while the girls sat motionless on the floor, staring at nothing. The third seemed promising until Rodney watched her shake Lily by the shoulders, demanding she just say something, anything. He fired her within the hour. After that came a rotation of warm smiles and cold efficiency, women who saw dollar signs in his grief, who treated his daughters like fragile museum pieces to be dusted and repositioned. Some were kind but ineffective. Others were competent but indifferent. None of them looked at the girls the way Catherine had, with a mother's fierce attention that saw past the silence to the souls trapped inside. Rodney stopped hoping for breakthroughs. He focused instead on what he could control: routines, safety protocols, surveillance. He told himself that if he couldn't heal them, he could at least keep them from further harm. But late at night, when the mansion settled into its vast, echoing quiet, he would sit in his office and watch old footage of Catherine twirling with the girls in the garden, their laughter bright and fearless. He would watch until the ache in his chest became unbearable. Then he would close the files and return to the live feeds, where 3 small figures in pink dresses sat in silence, waiting for a voice that would never come. Linda Jenkins arrived on a gray Monday morning with a single leather satchel and a resume so unremarkable that Rodney had nearly tossed it in the recycling bin. No prestigious nanny academies. No glowing references from society families. Just 5 years at a public elementary school, 2 years caring for an elderly aunt, and a brief note at the bottom that read, "I believe children hear more than we think." It was the kind of vague sentiment that usually made Rodney's jaw tighten, the sort of thing people said when they had no real qualifications to offer. But his assistant had been desperate, and the agency had run out of candidates willing to work in what they privately called the silent house. She stood in the foyer now, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral as she took in the vaulted ceilings and the marble staircase that curved upward like a question mark. She didn't gasp. She didn't compliment the architecture or the imported chandelier. She simply waited, her hands folded in front of her, while Rodney descended the stairs with the controlled urgency of a man who had already decided this would be another waste of time. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice clipped. "I assume the agency explained the situation." "They mentioned your daughters don't speak," Linda replied evenly. "They didn't explain why you've gone through 11 nannies in 18 months. Rodney blinked. Most candidates either ignored the turnover rate or made excuses for it. Linda simply stated it like a fact requiring clarification. He studied her more closely. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with dark eyes that didn't waver under his scrutiny. She wore a plain black dress and sensible shoes, no jewelry, no makeup, nothing that suggested she was trying to impress him. "The previous staff," he said slowly, "lacked the patience and commitment my daughters require. They need someone who understands that silence isn't emptiness." Silence is usually the loudest thing in the room, Linda said. If you're paying attention. Rodney felt something shift in his chest, a small crack in the wall he'd built around his expectations. He pulled out the tablet he'd prepared, the one with the care schedule, dietary restrictions, therapy appointment times, emergency protocols. He began to recite the list with the intensity of a general briefing soldiers before deployment. Linda listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, unflinching. When he finished, she asked only one question. Do the girls like music? Rodney frowned. I don't know. Why does that matter? Linda shrugged. Because rhythm doesn't require words. And everyone speaks something, Mr. Perron. You just have to learn their language. She picked up her satchel and waited for him to show her to the girls' rooms, as if she'd already been hired, as if his intensity was just whether she'd learned to dress for. For the first time in 3 years, Rodney didn't know what to say. Rodney didn't watch the feeds for the first 3 days. He told himself it was because he was busy, because a merger in Singapore demanded his attention, because the quarterly reports wouldn't review themselves. But the truth sat heavier in his gut. He was afraid of what he might see, another nanny sitting on her phone while the girls stared at walls, another well-meaning failure that would require him to start the hiring process all over again. So he stayed in his office, door closed, and let Linda Jenkins navigate the silence on her own. On the 4th day, restless and unable to focus on the contracts spread across his desk, he opened his laptop and pulled up the living room camera. The timestamp read 2:47 p.m. The girls should have been having their scheduled quiet time, lying on their individual mats with books they never read, a routine designed by the last nanny to encourage independent rest. Instead, the mats had been pushed aside. In the center of the room sat a large portable speaker, the kind used at outdoor parties, completely out of place among the cream sofas and carefully curated silence. Linda knelt on the floor beside it, and the 3 girls sat in a semicircle around her, their pink dresses fanned out like petals. Rodney leaned closer to the screen, his pulse quickening. Linda wasn't speaking. She placed her palm flat on top of the speaker, then gestured for the girls to do the same. Lily moved first, always the bravest, pressing her small hand against the black surface. Rose and Violet followed, their identical faces tilted in curiosity. Linda tapped something on her phone, and even through the silent feed, Rodney could see the speaker come alive. The girls flinched, but Linda kept her hand steady, her expression calm. She pointed to her palm, then to theirs, mouthing something Rodney couldn't decipher. The girls' eyes widened. Their fingers spread wider against the speaker, and Rodney realized with a jolt what they were feeling. Vibration. Not sound, but the physical presence of it, traveling through their skin like a secret language. Linda began to move her other hand in slow, rhythmic patterns, tapping her thigh in time with whatever bass line was pulsing through that speaker. The girls watched, transfixed. Then Lily, hesitant and bird-like, lifted her free hand and tried to mimic the pattern. Rose joined in a moment later, her rhythm slightly off but determined. Violet, always the last to trust, kept both hands on the speaker, feeling the music with an intensity that made Rodney's throat tighten. Linda didn't smile or praise them. She simply continued the rhythm, letting them find their own way into it. Rodney sat frozen in his chair, watching his daughters engage with something beyond their carefully managed routine, watching them reach toward a world he'd thought they'd abandoned forever. He didn't close the laptop. For the first time in months, he couldn't look away. Rodney had developed a routine with the feeds. He watched during his lunch hour, a 20-minute window where he could monitor Linda's methods without admitting to himself that he was becoming obsessed. He told himself it was quality control, due diligence, the same scrutiny he applied to quarterly earnings and acquisition targets. But the truth was harder to swallow. He was looking for proof that someone, finally, could reach his daughters in ways his money and desperation could not. What he saw over the next week defied every therapeutic model he'd paid experts to implement. Linda didn't use flashcards or reward systems. She didn't speak to the girls in the high-pitched, overly enthusiastic tone that other nannies had adopted. Instead, she moved through the house like water, fluid and unhurried, letting the girls come to her rather than forcing engagement. She would hum while folding laundry, not performing for them but simply existing in her own contentment. She would tap rhythms on the kitchen counter while preparing their meals, her fingers drumming patterns that the girls began, slowly, to anticipate. On Thursday afternoon, Rodney watched her introduce them to a collection of items that had no business being in his carefully curated home. A rain stick, a small hand drum, a wooden xylophone with chipped paint that looked like it had been salvaged from a garage sale. She placed them on the nursery floor without explanation, then sat cross-legged and waited. The girls, seated on their beds in identical poses, watched her with the wariness of deer at a forest's edge. Linda picked up the rain stick and tilted it slowly. Even without audio, Rodney could imagine the sound, that gentle cascade like water over stones. She didn't hand it to the girls. She simply played with it herself, tilting it back and forth, her expression thoughtful, as if she were alone. After 3 minutes, Rose slid off her bed and moved closer. Linda didn't acknowledge her, didn't break her concentration. Rose sat down beside her, close enough to see but not to touch. Then Violet joined, and finally Lily, forming a small circle around the instruments. Linda set down the rain stick and picked up the hand drum, tapping it with her fingertips in a pattern Rodney had seen her use before, the same rhythm she'd played on the speaker, on the counter, on her own thigh. This time, Lily reached out and touched the drum surface while Linda played, feeling the vibration. Linda paused, then placed the drum in Lily's lap and showed her how to hold it. Lily struck it once, tentatively. The hit was soft, barely a tap, but Linda nodded as if she'd heard a symphony. Rodney glanced at the timestamp. 3:17 p.m. He had a conference call in 10 minutes, but he couldn't make himself close the laptop. Rose had picked up the xylophone mallet and was examining it with scientific curiosity. Violet held the rain stick, tilting it carefully, watching whatever was inside tumble from end to end. And then it happened. Lily hit the drum again, harder this time, and the sound must have surprised her because her mouth opened, her shoulders lifted, and a noise came out. Not a word. Not even close. But a giggle, bright and sudden and utterly unmistakable. A sound so pure it seemed to shatter the silence that had encased Rodney's world for 3 unbearable years. He stood up from his desk so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. His hand covered his mouth, his eyes fixed on the screen where his daughter, his silent, unreachable daughter, was laughing. The giggle became Rodney's most watched footage. He saved the clip, backed it up on 3 separate drives, and played it during sleepless nights when the weight of the past 3 years threatened to crush him. But he didn't mention it to Linda. He wasn't sure how to explain that he'd been watching, that every moment of her work was being recorded and analyzed like surveillance footage from a corporate espionage case. So he stayed silent, observing from his digital perch, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was a language he didn't recognize. It started on a Tuesday morning. Rodney was reviewing contracts when he opened the kitchen camera out of habit. Linda stood at the counter preparing breakfast, and the girls sat at the table in their usual spots, Lily by the window, Rose in the middle, Violet at the end. But something was different. Linda's hands moved as she worked, not randomly, but in deliberate gestures that seemed to carry meaning. She would crack an egg, then touch her fingertips together and pull them apart. She would slice a banana, then make a quick motion like she was drawing a curve in the air. The girls watched her hands with an intensity that made Rodney lean closer to the screen. Then Lily lifted her own small hand and mimicked the curved motion. Linda paused, turned to face her fully and repeated it. Lily did it again, and Linda nodded, her expression serious, respectful. She wasn't praising a child. She was acknowledging a speaker. Over the following days, the hand gestures multiplied. Rodney watched Linda teach them during meals, during walks through the garden, during the quiet hours before bed. Some of the signs were obvious even to him, a finger to the lips for quiet, hands opening like a book for story time. But others were complex, layered, a fluid combination of movements that seemed to create sentences without sound. The girls absorbed it all with a hunger that unsettled him. They practiced during their playtime, signing to each other across the room, their faces animated in ways he hadn't seen since Catherine died. Rodney tried to research what he was seeing. He pulled up videos of American Sign Language, British Sign Language, every formal system he could find. None of them matched. Linda's signs were simpler in some ways, more intuitive, but also distinctly her own. She was inventing a language, or perhaps reconstructing one, tailored specifically to 3 girls who had forgotten how to make themselves heard. By the end of the second week, the girls were signing constantly. Rose would ask for juice without opening her mouth. Violet would tell Linda she was tired by touching her chest and closing her eyes. Lily, always the boldest, created her own signs and waited for Linda to understand them. A game of meaning-making that Linda played without hesitation. They were talking, Rodney realized with a mixture of awe and something darker he couldn't name. They were talking, and he had no idea what they were saying. He sat in his office, surrounded by technology designed to give him total visibility, and felt more shut out than ever. His daughters had found a voice, but it was one he couldn't hear, couldn't translate, couldn't access despite all his cameras and control. Linda had built a bridge to them, and he was standing on the wrong side of it, watching through glass he'd installed himself, understanding for the first time that surveillance was not the same as connection. The alert came at 2:34 a.m., a motion sensor triggered in the girl's bedroom. Rodney woke instantly, his hand already reaching for the tablet on his nightstand, his heart hammering with the particular panic of a parent who has already lost too much. The bedroom cameras flickered to life in grainy night vision, casting everything in shades of gray and green. He could see the 3 small beds arranged in a row, each with its white coverlet and carefully positioned stuffed animals. 2 of the beds were still, their occupants sleeping peacefully. The third was in chaos. Violet thrashed against her sheets, her small body rigid with terror, her mouth open in what must have been screaming though the cameras captured no audio. Her hands clawed at the air, fighting invisible threats, and Rodney's stomach turned. He'd seen this before in the months after the accident, the night terrors that left the girls soaked in sweat and trembling, the way they would wake and find no comfort in his presence, as if he were a stranger in their nightmare. He was halfway out of bed, ready to run down the hall, when Linda appeared in the doorframe. She must have heard Violet from her room on the 3rd floor, must have moved through the dark house with the sure-footedness of someone who already knew its geography by heart. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't rush to the bed or try to shake Violet awake, mistakes Rodney had made a dozen times, only to have his daughter recoil from him in confusion and fear. Instead, Linda moved slowly into the room and lowered herself to the floor beside Violet's bed. She sat cross-legged, her back straight, and simply placed her hand on the mattress near Violet's shoulder, not touching her but close enough to be felt. Rodney watched, frozen, as Linda began to breathe in an exaggerated rhythm, her shoulders rising and falling in a pattern so pronounced it was almost theatrical. Slow inhale, slower exhale, a cadence like waves on a shore. Violet's thrashing began to weaken. Her hands, still grasping at nothing, moved less frantically. Linda didn't speak, didn't hum, didn't do anything except breathe and wait. After what felt like an eternity but was probably less than 2 minutes, Violet's eyes opened. They were unfocused, still caught between sleep and waking, her face wet with tears she'd shed without sound. Linda made a sign then, one Rodney had seen her use before, a gentle tapping of her chest with her fingertips, the sign for safe or okay, or perhaps I'm here. Violet stared at her, breathing hard, and then slowly, shakily made the sign back. Linda nodded and extended her hand, palm up, an invitation without demand. Violet sat up, her small frame trembling, and placed her hand in Linda's. Linda guided it to her own chest, letting Violet feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, teaching her to match it. They sat like that for nearly 20 minutes, Linda on the floor and Violet on the edge of her bed, hands connected, breath synchronized. Rodney watched as his daughter's panic drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. When Violet finally lay back down, Linda stayed on the floor, her hand resting on the mattress until the girl's breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did Linda rise, check on the other 2 girls who had somehow slept through everything, and slip back out of the room like a ghost. Rodney sat in his bed, the tablet cooling in his hands, and realized he'd been holding his breath. Rodney came home early on Friday, a decision that surprised even him. He'd canceled an acquisition meeting in London, something he never did, claiming a scheduling conflict that didn't exist. The truth was simpler and more complicated. He needed to see his daughters with his own eyes, not through the cold mediation of camera lenses and digital feeds. He needed to step out of the surveillance room and into the actual world Linda had been building in his absence. The house was quiet when he entered, but it was a different kind of quiet than the suffocating silence he'd grown accustomed to. There was music playing somewhere, faint and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the living room. He moved toward it carefully, his footsteps soft on the marble floor, some instinct telling him not to announce his presence. What he saw when he reached the doorway stopped him cold. The furniture had been pushed to the edges of the room, creating an open space on the cream-colored carpet. The portable speaker sat in the corner, pulsing with a beat he could feel in his chest even from the hallway. Linda stood in the center of the space, barefoot, her usual reserve transformed into something fluid and alive. And around her, matching her movements with varying degrees of coordination, were his 3 daughters. They wore their pink dresses, but their feet were bare like Linda's, and their hair had come loose from the neat ponytails he'd seen them wearing that morning. They looked wild, untamed, more like the children they'd been before the accident than the careful ghosts they'd become after. Linda moved through a sequence of gestures that was part dance, part sign language, part something Rodney had no name for. The girls followed, their small bodies interpreting her movements with a seriousness that bordered on sacred. Linda spun, her arms extended, and the girls spun with her. She dropped to the floor, and they dropped. She rose slowly, her hands moving through signs Rodney recognized. Music, together, listen, and they rose with her, their hands tracing the same shapes in the air. It was a conversation conducted in motion, a dialogue that required no sound yet communicated everything. Then Linda changed the pattern. She placed her hands on her throat and made a new sign, one Rodney hadn't seen before. Her mouth opened, and even from the hallway he could see her singing, though the music was too loud for him to hear her voice. She repeated the throat gesture, looking at each girl in turn, an invitation that was also a challenge. Lily was the first. She placed her small hand on her own throat, mimicking Linda's gesture, and opened her mouth. Nothing came out at first, just air and effort. Linda didn't look disappointed. She repeated the motion, her face encouraging but patient. Lily tried again, and this time, faint but unmistakable, a sound emerged. Not a word, not yet, but a hum that matched the music's melody, fragile as spun glass. Rose joined in next, her hum slightly lower, harmonizing with her sister's. Violet held back, watching, and Rodney understood her hesitation with painful clarity. She was the one who'd seen Catherine die, the one sitting closest in the back seat, the one who'd held her mother's hand as the paramedics worked. But Linda didn't push. She simply continued dancing, continued singing, creating a space where Violet could enter if she chose. And then she did. Violet's hand went to her throat, and her mouth opened, and 3 years of silence shattered like a window breaking. Rodney stood in the hallway for what might have been seconds or minutes, time collapsing under the weight of what he'd witnessed. His daughters were humming, singing, making sounds he believed were lost forever. Tears blurred his vision, hot and unwelcome, the kind he hadn't allowed himself since Catherine's funeral. He should have felt pure joy. He should have walked into that room and gathered his girls in his arms, celebrating this impossible breakthrough. But what he felt instead was shame, thick and acidic, rising in his throat. Because he'd watched it all happen from behind a screen. Because he'd monitored Linda like a security threat rather than trusting her with the vulnerability he couldn't handle himself. Because in his need for control, he'd reduced his daughter's healing to surveillance footage, data points to be analyzed rather than moments to be lived. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and stepped into the doorway. The music was still playing, but the dancing had stopped. Linda stood with her back to him, the 3 girls clustered around her, their faces flushed with exertion and something that looked dangerously close to happiness. Rose noticed him first. Her eyes widened, and she tugged on Linda's sleeve, pointing. Linda turned, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a professional mask sliding into place where moments before there had been unguarded joy. "Mr. Perron," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I didn't realize you were home. I came back early." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rougher than usual. The girls had gone quiet again, not the traumatized silence of before, but the cautious quiet of children caught doing something they weren't sure was allowed. "I heard music." Linda's gaze held steady on his face, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, assessed, understood in ways that made his carefully constructed defenses feel transparent. "We were practicing," she said simply. "The girls have been working very hard." Rodney looked at his daughters, at their bare feet and loose hair, at the instruments scattered across the displaced furniture, at the evidence of a life being lived in his home without his permission or supervision. "I heard them," he said, and his voice broke on the last word. "I heard them singing." Lily made a small sign, her hands moving in a question he couldn't interpret. Linda signed something back and Lily nodded, then took her sister's hands and led them toward the hallway, presumably toward their rooms. They passed Rodney without making eye contact, three small ghosts in pink dresses who'd begun to remember they were alive. When they were gone, the silence that remained felt different, charged with things that needed to be said. "Miss Jenkins," Rodney began, then stopped. The formal address felt obscene after what he'd witnessed. "Linda, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not quit before I finish." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "That's an interesting way to start a conversation." He took a breath, steadying himself the way he did before difficult board meetings, except this was harder than any negotiation he'd ever navigated. "I've been watching you," he said. "Through cameras. Hidden cameras throughout the house. I've watched every interaction you've had with my daughters since the day you arrived. Every lesson, every meal, every moment." Linda didn't flinch. She didn't look betrayed or angry or even particularly surprised. She simply crossed her arms and tilted her head, studying him with the same patient attention she gave his daughters when they were struggling to communicate something difficult. "I know," she said. Rodney felt the ground shift beneath him. "You know. I'm not blind, Mr. Perron. There's a camera in the living room molding, one in the kitchen light fixture, another in the nursery bookshelf. You're thorough, I'll give you that." She moved to the speaker and turned off the music, plunging the room into a silence that felt suddenly oppressive. "The question isn't whether you've been watching. The question is why you're telling me now." He had prepared a speech during the walk from the hallway, something about security and protection and parental responsibility. But standing in front of her, watching the way she refused to make this easy for him, the practiced words dissolved. "Because I'm terrified," he said instead. "Because you did in 3 weeks what a parade of specialists couldn't do in 3 years, and I don't know how to exist in a world where I'm not the one solving problems with money and surveillance and control." Linda nodded slowly, as if he'd finally said something worth hearing. "Your daughters don't need a warden, Mr. Perron. They need a father." The words hit him like a physical blow. He thought of all the hours he'd spent in his office, watching his children through screens, believing that observation was a form of love. He thought of Catherine, who had danced with them in the garden, who had sung off-key and laughed at her own mistakes, who had never needed cameras to know what her daughters needed because she was present enough to simply see them. "I want to turn them off," he said. "The cameras. All of them. But I don't know how to keep them safe without watching." "You trust," Linda said simply. "You trust them to tell you what they need, even if they're still learning how. You trust me to do the job you hired me to do. And you trust yourself to be enough without the safety net of recorded evidence." Rodney walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Catherine used to dance with the girls, where 3 years of silence had started and where, perhaps, it could finally end. What if something happens? What if I miss the moment they need me? "Then you miss it," Linda said, and her voice was gentle but unyielding. "And you show up for the next one. That's what parents do. They don't watch life through a lens. They live it, messy and imperfect and terrifying as it is." That night, Rodney sat in his office and systematically disabled every camera in the house. Each one he turned off felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that the ground would hold him even though he couldn't see it. When he finished, the monitors went dark, and the mansion filled with a different kind of silence. From upstairs, he heard humming, 3 small voices finding their way back to sound. He closed his laptop and climbed the stairs toward them, walking into the loudest, most beautiful uncertainty he'd ever known.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you watched this video, you will definitely love the next one. It's more intriguing. Click on the link on the screen to watch the next video. Thank you.